Capcom vs SNK 2 is absolutely amazing. Throughout the fighting game genre's rich history, few titles offer the insane level of quality in which this one brings to the table. In fact, some would go as far to tell you that this was the apex of sprite-based fighters, delivering a magic moment that has since never been topped. This crossover game has it all, so join me today as we celebrate its history and look at exactly what it was that made this one so special. How did it top its predecessor? Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Capcom vs SNK 2, Mark of the Millennium 2001, one of the greatest fighting games ever made. Yeah. By the summer of 2001, we were now at a point in history where the Capcom vs concept was 5 years old. In the previous half a decade, we had experienced a lot of cool stuff. This all started in 1996 with the tantalising release of X-Men vs Street Fighter, which was spurred on and inspired by the inclusion of Akuma being placed as an unlockable character within X-Men Children of the Atom. This was followed up by Marvel Superheroes vs Street Fighter, which expanded the choice of characters to include Marvel characters other than just the X-Men, which was then followed up by the third game, Marvel vs Capcom, which would obviously expand Capcom's lineup to include more than just the cast of Street Fighter, introducing Mega Man, Morrigan and company. All three of these games were created to run on the Capcom System 2 arcade board, but the fourth entry, Marvel vs Capcom 2, would be programmed to run on more powerful hardware, the Sega Naomi arcade board, making it not only easy to port the game to the Sega Dreamcast, but also allow for the introduction of 3D backdrops and for the roster to be expanded to include 56 characters. This game was absolutely huge in scope. With Capcom and Marvel's working partnership coming to an end, fortunately the concept would be replaced with a new crossover on Naomi hardware, resulting in Capcom vs SNK Millennium Fight 2000, a game developed and published by Capcom to include characters owned by Capcom and fellow fighting game giants SNK. The agreement that had previously been made between SNK and Capcom had resulted in the release of a card game produced by SNK for the Neo Geo Pocket Color, and of course the Capcom produced fighting game for the Naomi and home platforms. While each separate company retained 100% of the profit generated by the crossover games they created each, the deal was popular enough and beneficial enough for both parties to create more games on both sides. Capcom vs SNK 2 Mark of the Millennium 2001, known as Millionaire Fighting 2001 in Japan, would be Capcom's epic follow-up to Millennium Fight 2000, and what an impressive title this is. For those who have played both of these games, straight from the get-go you will notice a new feature, a change in the groove system. In Millennium Fight you could choose between two. One groove offered mechanics more in line with the Street Fighter series, whereas the other was more in line with mechanics found in the King of Fighters series. Mark of the Millennium 2001 differs in that it now offered 6 different grooves instead of just 2, which really switches things up, so let's discuss how each of these grooves work. The C groove is a system reminiscent of the one found in the Street Fighter Alpha series, as observed in the third installment through the Aism. Its primary aspect involves a super gauge that is divided into 3 tiers. This gauge gradually fills during the course of the battle, enabling the utilisation of super moves. The potency of the button pressed for executing these moves not only influences the inflicted damage but also dictates the extent of the gauge depletion. Additionally, this system is the sole groove that permits aerial blocking. Other gameplay elements encompass a dash, guard cancel counterattacks, roll-in dodges and tactical recoveries. The A groove is just like Street Fighter Alpha 3's Vism. This mechanic also deactivates super moves in exchange for custom combos. These custom combos enable players to link hits seamlessly into each other within a combo. To initiate these combos, players need to press both hard attack buttons when their gauge is completely filled, after which it will gradually decrease. Additional gameplay elements include dash, guard, cancel counterattacks, rolling dodges and fall breakers. The P groove employs the iconic Super Gauge format from Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo, as seen in Street Fighter Alpha 3's Xism variant. The system revolves around a solitary gauge that gradually fills as the player inflicts or receives damage. Once this gauge reaches capacity, it grants access to a potent super move, or super desperation move. This mechanism also accommodates parrying, enabling players to deflect incoming attacks strategically to set up counterattacks, a technique reminiscent of the Street Fighter 3 series. Additional gameplay elements encompass a dash ability, a short jump mechanic and tactical recoveries. The other 3 grooves instead are built around SNK game mechanics. So with that said, let's address the S groove, a gameplay mechanic reminiscent of the King of Fighters 94 and 95, along with the extra mode from 97 and 98. In this system, players are required to accumulate energy in their power gauge by guiding their character to channel their inner chi. When the character's health is critically low, indicated by the traditional flashing red gauge, they gain the ability to perform level 1 super moves and super desperation moves an unlimited number of times. However, unleashing level 3 super moves and desperation moves necessitates both low health and a fully charged power gauge. In a faithful nod to the source material, this groove exclusively offers a sidestep dodge maneuver. Additionally, the gameplay entails a variety of other elements, including the ability to sprint, execute brief jumps, initiate guard cancel counterattacks, and strategically recover from difficult situations. The end groove is much like the system introduced in the King of Fighters 96 and continued onwards. Players accumulate stock as their power gauge fills. These stocks can be expended in various ways, including executing super moves or super desperation moves, obtaining temporary boosts to attack and defense, or performing a guard cancel for evasive maneuvers. Additional gameplay elements include mechanics like running, short jumping, counter-attacking with guard cancel moves, executing rolling dodges, and initiating full breakers. Finally, we have the K Groove, a gameplay system reminiscent of the Samurai Showdown series, featuring a power bar that gradually fills as the character sustains damage. Upon reaching maximum capacity indicated by the blazing Akari Rage emblem, the character's appearance will shift to a crimson hue and the gauge will commence gradual depletion. However, this state empowers the character's attacks, infusing them with heightened potency. Furthermore, the character gains the capability to execute level 3 supers during their interval, which persists until the gauge empties and the character's visual presentation reverts to its original state. This particular style of gameplay also incorporates the Just Defend mechanic inspired by Garu Mark of the Wolves. Notable additional gameplay attributes encompass a dashing maneuver, abbreviated jumping techniques, and the ability to counteract falls in a nimble manner. All these grooves present a huge number of options to experiment with, instantly making Capcom vs SNK 2 one of the most rich and diverse fighting games around, and this is of course only just scratching the surface of what this game brings to the table. Another substantial change from its predecessor, and an element that many fans would love with this one, was the return of a traditional 6-button control scheme. Something that had been absent in both the first Capcom vs SNK game and Marvel vs Capcom 2 as well, a popular choice indeed, particularly amongst fighting game diehards. In Polygon's oral history piece on the legacy of the franchise overall, James Chen, a Capcom vs SNK FAQ writer, would comment on this change, noting, when Capcom vs SNK 2 came out, that to me felt like this was the next great Street Fighter game because they added all the grooves. Capcom vs SNK 1, if people don't remember, put players' attacks on 4 buttons, and that didn't feel very Street Fighter-y, and I know a lot of people didn't like that. When Capcom vs SNK 2 came out and it went back to 6 buttons, I wrote FAQs for both of those games, and you can kind of see it in my FAQ for Capcom vs SNK 2 that I just keep talking about the fact that it's 6 buttons again and how wonderful it is. I was so happy that it was 6 buttons, and the graphics were so good. The gameplay was really solid in it. It really felt to me like this is where Street Fighter needs to go. In the FAQ itself, I'm like, you've got to play this game. Please play this game because it's so good. Let's make this game popular, you know? I'm practically begging readers to play the game because I was so enamored with it at the time, and I just thought it was going to be the next big thing. Beyond the excellent grooves and lauded control system, we can't talk about Capcom vs SNK 2 without talking about the game's roster. The character select screen offers up a huge selection of 48 fighters to choose from, which was way more than the game that came before it. The game once again utilises the power of the Sega Naomi arcade board, with the meat and potatoes of this game expectedly consisting of the player selecting a team of fighters from various Capcom and SNK games. They must fight each other's teams, winning battles by defeating all the opponents from the opposing team. Some elements included in the previous game make a return, but many are tweaked, including the ratio system. The first game allowed you to build a team based on certain characters' in-game power levels, which could total up to no more than 4. For example, you could build a team of 4 level 1 characters, have a team of 2 level 2 characters, or fight with 1 level 4 character. You were all good as long as the number added up to 4. Regarding the ratios in the game's sequel, teams this time can consist of no more than a maximum of 3 fighters, which I guess makes a lot of sense, as the previous game gave a player an advantage who selected 4 level 1 characters over other combination fighting teams. The old ratio concept in the previous game was a nice idea in theory, but it didn't deliver the most balanced experience. As mentioned earlier, this game contains 48 different fighters, which is a marked improvement over the number included in the previous game. The awesome decision would be made for this game to include fighters from a much broader range of different fighting games than what was offered up prior. As on the Capcom side of things, before for example we only had Street Fighter 2 characters and Morrigan. On the Capcom side of things this time, the roster would include for example Kyosuke from the Rival Schools franchise and Relento from Final Fight. However, to be fair, Relento did also appear within the Alpha series. Final Fight waifu Maki would also make her way over, and Eagle from the first ever Street Fighter game. Yun from Street Fighter 3 would also be the sole representative from the Street Fighter 3 games, which tells you all you need to know about what Capcom thought of that installment in the series at the time. Regarding SNK newcomers, there would be a lot on their side of things too, including characters being brought over from Garou Mark of the Wolf, Samurai Showdown Art of Fighting, Psycho Soldier and The Last Blade 2, just to name a few games that characters would be drawn from. From all of this, it is clear that the roster is more diverse in terms of franchises included than with the previous game, but it remains very Street Fighter and King of Fighters heavy at its heart, which is nothing to complain about, I suppose. Speaking of the many fighters this game includes, you would hope that Capcom would have gone to the effort to redraw many of their sprites to make sure they all fit into this game's new environment and look as awesome as all of the fresh SNK characters they had drawn. But nope, sadly, that wasn't the case at all. As amazing as this game is, nearly all of the Capcom character sprites have been plucked from other games, preventing it from feeling completely uniform and a bit lazy in the art direction in places. The most egregious of these is of course the inclusion of Morrigan's 1994 Darkstalker sprite work, which was now 7 years old by this point. It almost felt like a running gag, considering how many times across so many games this exact sprite work had been included in. In contrast, the SNK characters look really nice, and it was great to see Capcom's interpretation of each of them. In terms of the stage backdrops, you will probably notice that the 2D backgrounds from the first game are gone, and 3D backdrops have been drawn in their places. This graphical style is identical to that used in Marvel vs. Capcom 2, which we covered on this channel at an earlier date. As you would expect from a game programmed to run on the Sega Naomi arcade hardware, the first platform the game would arrive on would be the Sega Dreamcast after the arcade. GameSpot would cover the launch of this game in October of 2001, which would only see a release in Japan on this platform due to Sega of America cutting off support to the system in the West by that point. With regards to GameSpot's take on the first console porting of this title, they gave their thoughts, stating they believe the changes in the game will have a more significant impact depending on how serious you are about your 2D fighters. The new additions make the game technically superior to the first, but not necessarily better enough to merit purchase if you already have the first one. GameSpot would go on to criticise the game's 6-button controls, stating they were not suitable for a Dreamcast pad, whilst praising the game's groove system, allowing the player a lot of customisable options. Another aspect they would praise would be a feature they would debut in the console version of this game, which is an unlockable ability to create your own groove, offering even more customization than before. GameSpot, like myself, would criticise the reuse of many very old sprites in the game, stating, Capcom vs SNK 2 looks about the same as last year's game. It's been said before, but some of these characters look simply archaic by now. One-Eyed Sagat hasn't changed since Street Fighter Alpha from 1995, and Morrigan the Succubus from Darkstalkers series dates back even earlier. The game's biggest graphical problem is still that the art style throughout is so inconsistent from character to character. GameSpot would rave about the stage backdrops though, with praise such as the characters all seem to blend in well with the game's attractive new fully 3D backgrounds, which are filled with some really obscure references to some of Capcom's and SNK's older games. The write-up concluded with, fans of the first Capcom vs SNK game should be pleased with a sequel if they don't expect too much from it. Capcom vs SNK 2 offers just enough additions and changes to be justifiable as the next complete game in the series, though it doesn't take any major detours. It's cut from the same cloth as countless other Capcom fighting games, but it's got more features, more characters and more depth than a lot of them. Review sources appear to like this Dreamcast game too, with TotalGames.net for example calling it the most beautifully balanced, well-crafted 2D beat-em-up to grace God's fair earth. With a Dreamcast dead and mostly buried in the West, the game would launch worldwide in the living room when it was ported over to the Sony PlayStation 2, a platform which to this very day is still the most popular games console of all time. GameSpot would revisit this game on a different platform literally 1 month later, confirming that the PlayStation 2 version of this 2D fighting game is essentially identical to the Dreamcast version that was recently released in Japan. As a result, the PS2 review for this game by GameSpot is pretty similar to their Dreamcast article, although they did upgrade the review score from 7.8 to 8.1 for what appears to be on account for the fact that the PS2 at the time had less decent 2D fighters than that of the Dreamcast. IGN would praise it too, stating it is a very fine 2D fighter. The only disadvantage to its arrival on the PS2 is its inevitable difficulty caused by the PS2 controller. Past this point, the game would arrive on both the original Xbox and the Nintendo GameCube, meaning that the game had appeared across all 4 major consoles that generation. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe this was the first Capcom fighting game to appear on a Nintendo console since Street Fighter Alpha 2 on the Super Nintendo, so it had been a while for the big N. The ports of these systems were tweaked from the PS2 and the Dreamcast versions, and as a result the game was released as Capcom vs SNK 2 EO, with the EO standing for Easy Operation. Easy Operation referred to a change in control mechanics that allowed the player to perform special attacks by simply moving the right analog stick in a certain direction. All the home console versions of the game include some bonus characters, such as Evil Ryu, Shin Akuma, and Ultimate Rugal for example. All of these characters are powered up versions of existing fighters within the arcade game. The GameCube version of the game contains a new groove known as the GCC groove, which has simplified controls for the GameCube's inferior controller that is, in my opinion, less suitable for fighting games. And yes, Smash Bros doesn't count. The Xbox version of the game would include online play for up to 2 players via the use of the Xbox Live service. As expected from a 2D game, which as you would gather would be fairly simple to run on the 4 consoles the game was ported to, the game is virtually identical across all 4 systems with only minor differences. Despite this, the GameCube version of the game would receive lower scores than other platforms due to the console's poor native controller, which was not designed paying any thought into how traditional fighting games would handle on the platform. In Polygon's oral history piece on Capcom vs SNK, former Capcom community manager Seth Killian would comment on this amazing game, stating, "Capcom vs SNK 1 was not a bad game, but its slow, low-stakes style created a black hole where hype went to die. Capcom vs SNK 2 felt like a game that said yes to pretty much every dumb idea that designers suggested and yet somehow made it all work. It was simultaneously traditional and wild, a return to classic 2D Street Fighter style combat, but with a huge roster, the widest and wildest system mechanics in Capcom history, plus the chance to mix them all to taste. A return to the Capcom style 6-button controls added an essential dose of extra moves. The match flow got tightened up, limiting players to 3 characters per team, but the system mechanics went bananas, offering players a choice of 6 entirely different flavours for each of their favourite characters. Grooves didn't just swap super moves, they changed everything, from defensive options on down to core movement mechanics. Combine that amount of choice with 48 characters and you've got a huge space for players to experiment and explore. Personally, I don't think you could provide a better description than that explaining why this game is now so beloved. Capcom vs SNK 2 easily sits at the top of the pile as one of the greatest sprite-based fighting games ever, and it is no wonder really why so many are so fond of this one, continuing to yearn for a modern sequel. The experience that can be found here is truly epic. Anyway, if you enjoyed this one, subscribe for my upcoming new video on SNK vs Capcom SVC Chaos. And check out my upload on Street Fighter EX, the black sheep of the Street Fighter family. Yeah! Cheerio.